Hey, I'm John Allure. Before you listen to this episode, a couple of things. These are podcasts from the first season of Who Killed Theresa, and they're very raw. They were unedited. I haven't gone back and checked over them. I pondered about whether I should do these. Many people found them, I do, amateurish and kind of not very good, but others really kind of liked that raw nature to them. So I've just released them as they are. Don't come to me asking questions about them. This was an iterative process. So what I thought 7 years ago is not what I believe today. And then on that note, I'll be closing down Who Killed Theresa over the next 6 months. I'll run the remaining of the first season episodes. But I've started a new podcast called Undiluted Hocus Pocus, The Wonder of Problems. We'll talk about puzzles and games, and sometimes we'll talk about unsolved murders and police negligence. And you can find that on Spreaker at Undiluted Hocus Pocus. Also, you can check it out on all your major platforms, Spotify and iTunes, etc. And we'll set up social media pages for it as well. So it's a pretty unique name, Undiluted Hocus Pocus. If you put it into a search engine, I'm sure you'll find us. Thanks for listening. And once again, life isn't fair, justice is blind and dysfunctional, and some cops aren't smart like on television. This is Who Killed Theresa. Hi, welcome to the podcast. This is Who Killed Theresa. I've been giving some thought and research to the matter of the man convicted in the first-degree murder of Lelani Silva, Luke Gregoire, being the serial killer suspected in the deaths of a number of prostitutes and troubled young women, among others, in the Calgary area of Canada from 1991 to 1993. I was not intending to do a podcast on a series of unsolved murders in Calgary, but nevertheless, the more I looked at it, the more I felt compelled that there was something here to look at. So you can consider this a one-off podcast where we're going to leave the confines of Quebec for a while. It was starting to feel a little claustrophobic there anyway, so I don't mind taking a little break. And we're gonna look back 25 years at the Alberta, at the Calgary region, particularly Calgary, and in discussing a series of cold cases from there. People from that region, these cases will be very familiar to many of you. And if you go back 25 years, what was going on at that time? Well, let's think of it. We're coming up on the anniversary of the Rodney King verdict and the riots that happened in Los Angeles after that. So that was going on around this time. Musically, we had LL Cool J, NWA, Ice Cube. We had Nirvana. Nirvana's Nevermind came out in this era. And then we had just a terrible period in the Western provinces, particularly in Alberta and British Columbia, of young women going missing and nothing really being done about it. Now, a lot of attention became eventually focused on Robert Pickton, the pig farmer from British Columbia, who was eventually convicted and is implicated in between 20 to 40 murders of young prostitutes from the downtown east side of Vancouver. But he certainly doesn't account for all of it. And since that time, there's been many task forces that have come forward to try to solve these cold cases. The one that comes to mind is Project Care. Certainly has spent a great deal of time and attention, and yet nothing gets resolved and nothing gets cleared. And you got to wonder, 25 years ago, not only was there the consciousness to retain DNA, but there were the tools to use DNA to solve crimes. And yet, most of these cases, we don't get anything cleared through the use of forensic evidence, and it's hard to fathom how that could happen. But nevertheless, don't forget that sometimes a task force becomes a convenient mechanism to sort of dislodge all the garbage in your unit. Task force is formed by a number of specialty units sort of giving up certain officers or FTEs and dedicating them to that unit, and often it becomes an opportunity for supervisors to get rid of ne'er-do-wells, or their force fuck up, their nutballs, their oddballs, people they just don't want anymore. And we certainly in the land of fiction, a show like The Wire taught us that very, very well, and The Wire is very, very grounded on fact about the policing in the Baltimore area. So these cold cases, as I say, they've been a point of frustration to the RCMP, Calgary Police Services, and certainly the Calgary community for the last 25 years. And if you want some background on that, I've written quite extensively in the last 24 hours about this on my website. And there's two articles from the Calgary Herald I would draw your attention to. One is called Homicide When the Trail Goes Cold. The other one is 505 Killings, 25 Years, What Our Analysis Says About Calgary. And in his 2012 book, Cold North Killers, Lee Maylor dubs what has become to be known the Calgary prostitute murders. And he discusses them, singling out the files of Jennifer Jans, Jennifer Joyce, Keely Pincott, Tracy Maunder, and Rebecca Boutillier, and suggests that possibly another 6 unsolved female murders may be linked. And what he says is that, and I quote, "Then as soon as the killings started, they stopped. Police suspect the killer may have been jailed for another crime." And to that I say, it turns out there is an offender who fits the profile on the timeline, and that offender is Luc Yolande Gregoire. The Calgary cases unfolded between July 1991 and March 1993. Gregoire was released from prison in Alberta January 1991 and rearrested in May 1993 for the Silva murder. Initially, when Gregoire was apprehended, there was a lot of attention given to the matter, with police reporting that they were investigating Gregoire for other murders. A May 7th, 1993 Calgary Herald article references Gregoire in relation to the then unsolved murder of Deline Hempel, as well as the Maunder and Boutillier cases. But gradually all the attention dies down, and in fact today the only reference you can find linking Gregoire to any of these cases is found in sort of obscure dark corners of like web subreddits and web sleuth websites and things like that. But it's very hard to get a comprehensive picture of the whole story. So I'm gonna attempt to thread that needle with a particular focus on the Gregoire case. So was Gregoire the Calgary prostitute murderer? And I think to answer that question, as I said, I used a number of documents. But interesting enough, the way this came about is over the weekend, somebody sent me a link and said, "Have you seen this?" And what it was a database that was created by an Indigenous woman activist, Marianne Pierce. And years ago, she created a database called An Awkward Silence, Missing and Murdered Vulnerable Women and the Canadian justice system. And how that came about is she was somebody who was very, very vested in this matter of so many women, particularly Indigenous women, disappearing and nothing coming of it. She became, many activists became very, very frustrated that there didn't seem to be any kind of comprehensive information about all the cases. So what Marianne Pierce decided to do was to build her own database. And she used that as the basis of research to complete her PhD. My understanding is she's now Dr. Marianne Pierce. And then she released that information publicly. You can find it on the web in PDF format, or more useful, as a shared Google Doc. You can download it into Excel format. It's completely searchable, and it's very elegant in its simplicity. It just gives the names of the victims, where they disappeared from, whether it was resolved, whether the victim was Caucasian or Aboriginal, etc., etc. It's about, I'd say, about 12 fields, and contains, I believe, 4,000 entries. Now, it's not completely comprehensive. It was used for her research, and at some point, she stopped using it. She received her doctorate. So certainly when I went on and looked at it, a number of the Quebec cases I was talking about aren't there yet. Well, they're not there because at the time she was compiling it, they didn't exist. I hadn't loaded them on the internet yet. But nevertheless, it's very, very useful. And so I began to think, and this is the other thing, it's hard enough compiling Quebec cases, and that's my labor of, well, it's not labor of love, labor of hate. So I'm willing to put in the time, but whenever sort of the question came up of, boy, it would be interesting to do some research on Gregoire and see what he was up to in Alberta in the years he was there, I kind of left it behind, because that would involve, going to Lethbridge's police site and Calgary's police site and Banff and Edmonton, and even assuming that they had cold case information on there, sort of researching it all and then logging it, and frankly, I wasn't that invested in it. But Marianne Pierce had done all this work for us, for all the provinces and territories, going back a substantial amount of time. I think her work ended in 2015. So this became very exciting. All of a sudden, you could very quickly get a picture of who was murdered or missing in the environment of Luc Gregoire between 1991, 1993, when he was released on parole in that province, and we assume possibly active. So here's what I did. So what I'm going to talk about here is primarily linking three documents. And the first document was, and we talked about this 2 episodes ago when we talked about Gregoire. It's a 1993 report commissioned by the Correctional Services of Canada, analyzing the pre-indicators that led up to the first-degree murder charge of Luc Gregoire after his statutory release from prison in Calgary, Alberta, on January 21st, 1991. The second document is a report from a Calgary sociologist named Augustine Brannigan on the victimization of prostitutes. And it's also available online, and you can get it by going to my website. And what this document provided is where Marianne Pierce's spreadsheet is very to the point and sparse, useful but sparse. Augustine Brannigan's document fleshes out a lot of the details of these cases, particularly the 10 or 11 that we're going to discuss. And then, of course, the last thing I did was the database, An Awkward Silence. And as I say, that's available online. And for a really interesting read on the work that a number of Indigenous activists have done over time about missing and murdered women, I would direct you to the article, The Vanishing of Canada's First Nations Women. And you can find also that link on my website. So first, some background on Gregoire. Let's do a little recap. You might have listened to episodes ago, but in case you didn't, let's talk a little bit about him. Recall that Gregoire had a very varied criminal history in Quebec. Everything from drug trafficking to bank robbery to possession of stolen goods, sexual assaults. It ran the gamut. And that he did not particularly target any specific type of victim. He was an equal opportunity offender. He would target moms and prostitutes and the lady who worked at the convenience store. It really didn't matter to him. Whoever was in his sights when he felt the compulsion, that's who he would go for. So recall that we know that in 1979 he was charged with an assault on a woman when he was serving in the Quebec Airborne and stationed in Germany. In 1981, he assaulted a mother of 4 in a parking lot in Sherbrooke, Quebec, and attempted to choke her with his bare hands. In 1983, Gregoire was arrested in Montreal for an assault on a prostitute, where he attempted to have sex with her and her injuries resulted after she refused. In 1985, he was arrested in Slave Lake, Alberta, and charged with possession of cocaine for the purposes of trafficking. And I think that's important because as we get to some of these other cases, we see that some of these women were not only prostitutes, but they were involved in the drug culture and certainly would have been involved in either the purchase of drugs or the distribution of drugs. In the month leading up to his murder of Lainey Silva, his behaviors appear to be similarly random. April 6, 1993, so this is a month before Silva's death, Gregoire assaults a Calgary prostitute with a roofing hammer. May 2nd, 1993, Gregoire attempts to abduct Ada Ewan in front of her Castle Ridge home. And then finally, the murder of Silva. Silva is a 7-Eleven employee who Gregoire abducts when she's washing the store windows at 12:30 p.m., May 3rd, 1993. Gregoire rapes and murders by strangulation Silva in his car, and he dumps her body in Calgary. So what we're going to do now is walk through a timeline. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to sort of cross-reference from year to year entries from this report from Corrections Services of Canada about Gregoire, cross-reference those with entries from the Augustine Brannigan document on the victimization of prostitutes, along with some other information. So, here's what we know. May 1986, Gregoire is convicted and sentenced in Edmonton, Alberta on charges of robbery, 4 years, unlawful use of a firearm, 3 years consecutive with a 10-year probation, possession of prohibited weapons, 2-year concurrent. He serves 3.5 years before he's being granted release on mandatory supervision. And that occurs January 1st, 1991. Gregoire is released on mandatory supervision, and he's living in January of 1991 in Edmonton, Alberta. And this is important because if you got any murders or crimes you want to pin to Gregoire between May 86 and January 21st, 1991, you can't because he's incarcerated. So continuing. February 1991, Gregoire is assessed by his parole supervisor as high risk, medium needs. psychological intervention is seen as essential and is being pursued. Abstention from intoxicants is listed as part of his action plan. Gregoire reports attending bars to test himself and is cautioned by his supervisor, Bruce Anderson. Now, a few thoughts on that. I don't know. Anyone who the very idea of an alcoholic entering a bar in order to test themselves, you just know not to do that. It's just something you do not do. My take on that is complete bullshit. If he reported that to his supervisor, he's going to bars with the intention to drink. May 1991. Gregoire is referred to a treatment center to determine need for counseling. June 1991. The semi-nude body of Shauna Vanderbash, age 20, is found on June 20th, 1991, in a ditch beside a gravel road southwest of Calgary near the town of Prostitute. This was going to be the first of 3 murders in 1991. The evening before the body was discovered, Miss Vanderbash had been seen in a downtown nightclub in the company of a man with whom she left after midnight. She had been in Calgary for 6 months since moving from Vancouver. She had worked as a hairdresser and as an escort. The cause of death was strangulation. Vanderbash was not known as a street prostitute, and nothing was published about her activities as an escort. However, the way the body was discarded bears comparison with both previous and subsequent cases. And that's end quote, and that's from the Brannigan document. Now, at this point, I will note, we have Gregoire saying he's going to bars. We have Vanderbash being picked up in a downtown nightclub by a man after midnight. But I caution you here, Gregoire's in Edmonton, and this incident occurs in Calgary. They are a 3-hour car ride away. It's problematic for me to believe that he would, although not impossible, that he would violate the conditions of his parole by traveling without authorization to Calgary. Although we'll see that this is not, as we go forward here, that this is not unprecedented behavior in Gregoire. But just keep in mind, he's not in Calgary at this point. July 1991. The second 1991 case involved an adolescent. Jennifer Jans's body is unearthed at a construction site on August 13th near Valley Ridge Road and the Trans-Canada Highway on the western edge of Calgary in a shallow grave. She is, quote, battered and apparently died from a massive blow to the chest. She was a 16-year-old who left home after completing grade 9 to live with her street friends. She attended a Christian camp in Texas in September-October. Upon returning to Calgary, she tried unsuccessfully to re-enter high school and drifted back and forth between her family and the street. She was last seen by her family on July 10th when she was driven to the hospital by her father for medical treatment. She appeared close to becoming reconciled with her family in the weeks before she disappeared. Whether she was involved in street prostitution was not publicly disclosed, and the case has not been cleared. At the same time, July 1991, Gregoire attends treatment and becomes agitated at the length of time required for an assessment, and the interview is terminated. Under the circumstances, the attending psychologist closes the file and notes that there would be no benefit in having him re-referred. Now, also at this time, a community risk needs management scale is completed, which assesses Gregoire as low risk, medium needs. Gregoire is reluctant to see a psychologist, but says he's meeting regularly with a pastor of a local church who is trained in counseling. And again, I would say it's hard to trust anything that that Gregoire says. He is a pathological liar and always seems to give the right answer, to indicate that he's doing the right thing. And of course, no one ever bothers to go back and corroborate anything that Gregoire says to see that if his words actually match up to his actual actions. The third 1991 case, this is August 1991, involves, after the Jans murder, is that of Jennifer Joyce, age 17, who's reported missing from her group home on August 30th, having last been seen at her home on August 10th. Her nude and partially decomposed body is found in a wooded area near Springbank, west of the city limits, on October 7th, 1991. 2 kilometers south of the spot where Jennifer Jans's body was found on August 13th. The body had been in the area for at least a month, according to police, and the cause of death was not publicized. Concurrent with this, August 1991, during a regular supervision appointment, Gregoire is observed to have a black eye and scratches. He explains that he was at a nightclub drinking and intervened on behalf of a woman who was being beaten. Case notes report that this is the first indication that he is drinking again. And again, I would say, although he's in Edmonton and the Joyce case is Calgary, one wonders if the black eye and scratches were given to him by someone like Joyce, if not Joyce herself, before she died. It's a curiosity. Perhaps his story's right, that he was came to the rescue of a woman in a nightclub, but it doesn't seem to fit any of his other modus operandi. He seems all too frequently to be getting in trouble with prostitutes and young women and attacking them. November, December 1991. Another assessment session is scheduled. However, Gregoire is unable to attend due to employment in Calgary. 1-month travel permit is issued to Calgary. Community risk needs management scale is completed. Alcohol use is reported, but is not seen as problematic. Low risk, medium needs is the assessment that is maintained. Supervision at this time is transferred to Calgary since offender Gregoire will now be working there permanently. So November, December is when we first get Gregoire moving permanently to the city of Calgary. January 1992. On January 18th, 1992, the body of a teenager, Anita Gilovish, is found in a bird sanctuary in the east end part of Calgary. Family mention that she ran with a, quote, rough crowd and cited the use of drugs, and she's possibly involved in prostitution, but we have nothing to substantiate this. And unfortunately, that's all we know on the case of Anita Gilovish. Well, that's all I know. If somebody else knows more, please let me know. March 1992, the case of Keely Louise Pincott, age 29. News reports describe Pincott as a mother, barmaid, and waitress. Pincott went missing after working as a barmaid several days before her body was discovered. There was no evidence that she was involved in street prostitution. The cause of death is unknown or unpublished. Her skeletal remains were found 2 kilometers north of Cochrane in a shallow grave in a dead-end road used as a lover's lane on the 10th of March, 1992. Police identified the body as that of Pincott shortly thereafter. The location of the remains, some 40 kilometers northwest of Calgary, raised questions about a common killer in the Jans, Joyce, and Pincott cases. In September 1994, An Edmonton RCMP crime analyst suggested that police had a suspect in the 3 murders, but insufficient evidence for an arrest. Subsequent reports have failed to substantiate this. Now, at the same time, in March of 1992, Gregoire is assessed, and the report notes of his reluctance to participate in counseling, and concludes that there would be little benefit in forcing him to attend. In terms of alcohol use, it suggests that if it results, quote, in any criminal charge while he is still on parole, then his parole conditions should be varied to abstain and attend treatment for further assessment. July 1992, another community risk needs management scale is completed on Gregoire by Alberta Justice Parole Supervisor Betty Buss. Gregoire's use of alcohol is seen as a major focus of supervision, and notes that should alcohol cause a change in the current situation, further action will be initiated. Gregoire's case plan includes the reduction of use by 1/2. The general statistical information on recidivism rating is recorded as a +4, although a new rating has not been completed, and the Edmonton supervision records consistently referred to a rating of -8. He is assessed as low risk, low needs, and supervision frequency is reduced from twice to once per month. A couple of things about that. Here's what I know about the recidivism thing. That the Edmonton risk assessment was much worse than what they were giving to him in Calgary, although a full assessment hadn't even been done. That's what I know. And it's interesting that about his frequency. So if he's to meet with his parole supervisor now once per month, as opposed to twice per month, if when he was living in Edmonton, he only had to check in every 2 weeks, that leaves a hell of a window to travel. You could envision him traveling to Calgary, although taking a hell of a chance to violate your parole. But given Gregoire's behavior, he was a guy who took risks. August 1992, another case comes forward to the Calgary police. The case involves a transsexual Jean McMaster. No story appeared in the Herald. Disappointing, but not surprising. It is not known whether McMaster was working as a prostitute, nor is the cause of death known at this time, and the McMaster case remains uncleared. And McMaster, and this is important, was found August 8th, 1992 at 68th Street Southeast in Calgary. And incidentally, if you want to see a plotting of where all the dump sites are, I created a little map, and that's on my website. You can go have a look and see if that means anything to you. September 1992. Gregoire reports to his parole supervisor an unauthorized trip to Banff. A case conference is held with the director of Calgary Central Parole Office, and Gregoire is verbally reprimanded. Now, this is important because in the case of, we talked about Pincott and her skeletal remains being found north of Cochrane. Cochrane is on the road to Banff. And we don't know when his unauthorized trip was taken to Banff. We only know that he reported it in September, but that doesn't necessarily mean it occurred in September or the month prior to his last check-in with parole. He self-reported here. He self-disclosed that he had been to Banff. But we don't know what other occasions that he traveled without authorization and chose not to report at all. October 1992. The next case involved Tracy Lynn Maunder, who was a 26-year-old single mother. She was seen by the building manager in the apartment complex where she lived on October 28, 1992. and her appearance was confirmed later that evening on the main stroll by other prostitutes. Since her child was under supervision of a babysitter, her disappearance was noticed immediately. Her partially clad body was discovered on November 1st in a grassy field in the area of 17th Avenue Southeast between Garden and Shepherd Roads on the outskirts of Calgary. I'd also note that what was the outskirts in 1992 may not be the outskirts nowadays. Clearly, Calgary has seen tremendous growth in the last quarter century. Maunder had been beaten and stabbed to death. She was survived by her 11-year-old son, a son she bore when she was only 14 years old. She had worked previously as a waitress and had been prostituting for about 6 months prior to her murder, apparently to support her son. At the time of her murder, she was battling cancer. In subsequent investigations, the RCMP discovered a knife near the scene of the crime. And like the others, this case has not been cleared. And at this time, Gregoire is granted a 6-day travel permit to Edmonton to pursue legal action against the service as a result of his 1988 assault at the correctional institution. Recall, I think we discussed this on the Gregoire episode, that he was assaulted while in prison in 1988. November 1992. Deline Hempel was a waitress when she was abducted on her way home from work, November 16, 1992. 5 months after Deline's disappearance, the search ended in tragedy when her body was discovered. A man, unknown to the young waitress, had followed her home from the bar where she worked and lured her from her car. Stephen Bearns then shot her twice in the back of her head and buried her in a shallow grave in sight of his living room window. Bearns committed suicide while in prison in 2005. I would merely note the instances of bodies in shallow graves, the Jans case, the Joyce case, and the Pincott case, possibly related to Bearns, but we may never know because Bearns is dead. December 1992. Claudette Colette Anstil. I'm butchering the pronunciation on that last name. It's Anctil, but that's the best. That's what I got. Her body is found beside an apartment building at 1339 10th Avenue Southeast. She was 27 years old and was known by the police to frequent the low-track stroll around the National Hotel. And presumably these are locuses where prostitutes gather. She was also known as a narcotics user. She disappeared late on Wednesday, December 2nd, and her bloodied body was discovered early on December 3rd, 1992. The police did not release the cause of death. Then at the same time, December 92, a community risk needs management scale is again completed on Gregoire. Alcohol consumption is reported as reduced to the point that Gregoire is now saving money through a registered retirement savings plan, an RRSP. Top of the year, February 1993, the new year. Rebecca Boutillier was reported missing by her mother on February 12, 1993, after failing to return home to care for her 14-month-old child. Boutillier, age 20, had worked the streets since age 17 and had had problems with narcotics. The reports in the press in February and March detailed her mother's attempts to circulate the photograph of her missing daughter to help track down her whereabouts. On Thursday, March 11th, 1993, a naked body was discovered in a crop field in the extreme northwest outskirts of the city. There were obvious, quote, wound marks on the body, which was partially covered by grass. She was stabbed. The body was identified on Friday of Boutillier But at the time, there were outstanding reports of 3 missing females, any one of whom could have been that of the unidentified. Police questioned Boutelier's estranged common-law husband, Stanley Wayne Sellinger, age 28. Sellinger was due to appear in court on February 26 to face assault charges involving Boutelier and their son. Avery, arising from an incident reported December 30th, 92, because of Boutelier's disappearance on February 12th, the assault case was adjourned. Sellinger was never charged in the homicide. However, the assault case was brought to trial along with related charges on July 27th. The Crown dropped the assault charges, and Sellinger pled guilty to 2 charges of possession of a restricted weapon, a switchblade and a martial arts stick, and he was fined $800. And the homicide of Boutelier has not been cleared. February 18th, 1993, during a routine office interview, Gregoire reports to parole supervisor Buss that he has been charged. Her case notes read in part, "Got charged, impaired, in care plus control, was sleeping in car because he had had a few, cut it out." The notes continue to discuss the status of his RRSP and the health benefits membership. Now, I inadvertently skipped this, but yes, in January 31st, 93, Gregoire is charged with impaired driving after being found asleep at the wheel of his car at midnight in the parking lot of a convenience store close to his home. He is issued an appearance notice and released. There is no record of notification of this arrest to the Alberta Justice Duty Officer. Now, in a parking lot of a convenience store close to his home, just keep that in your mind and we'll get to it, but I think it's important. March 22nd, 1993, Gregoire's case notes indicate, quote, "Waiting for end now. Keep straight after Wednesday." And I think what this relates to is that the parole supervisor was, on paper, seeing an improvement in Gregoire's behavior and believing he was going to get greater freedoms and release conditions. But what she was missing was the fact that he was being charged or up to bad behaviors that were not being reported. April 6, 1993. Gregoire is charged with assault with a weapon on a female at approximately 0300 hours after a Calgary prostitute complains that she was assaulted with a roofing hammer by a client. Gregoire is released on $200 bail later that morning. There is no record to the Alberta Justice Duty Officer of his arrest. April 16th, 1993. The final case note entry reads, "Police done today. Starting to celebrate. Take it easy. On parole to May 13th. No need to report." So I think, again, this is saying he's just swimming along. We've seen him on the 16th. We'll see him again in a month, but we're not observing any problems here. May 2nd, 1993. Adea Ewan reports to Calgary police that a man attempted to abduct her in front of her home at approximately 11:30 at night. She is able to escape and drives to a nearby store where she reports the incident. May 3rd, 1993. So this is within an hour of the Ada Ewan attempted abduction. Approximately 1 hour after the attempted abduction on May 2nd, Lainey Silva disappears from her workplace. There is substantial media coverage of this event. Later, on May 3rd, 1993, the Alberta Justice Duty Officer at the Bow River Correctional Centre is contacted by the Calgary Police Service which is seeking unspecified information concerning offender Gregoire. They are told a message will be left for parole supervisor Buss, who will contact them in the morning. Offender Gregoire is arrested at 22:30 hours, May 3rd, 1993, and charged with unlawful confinement. At approximately 0150 hours on May 4th, 1993, the Alberta Justice Duty Officer is advised of the arrest by the Calgary Police Service. A suspension warrant is issued and received by Calgary Police at approximately 2:30 in the morning, May 4th, 1993. Again, May 4th, 1993, the body of Lainey Silva is found in Calgary, and offender Gregoire is charged with first-degree murder. There is considerable media coverage, including a media conference by the Calgary Police Service, and it is reported that inmate Gregoire is being investigated concerning other disappearances. A sensational incident report is filed this date by the director of Calgary Central Parole Office. May 11th, 1993, the suspension report is completed and recommends revocation. May 13th, 1993, offender Gregoire's statutory release is revoked. So here are some of my thoughts on this matter. Certainly first, as we've said, the where Gregoire was living in Edmonton and not Calgary. It's problematic. Is it possible he committed those murders of Van de Bash, Jans, and Joyce? It's possible, but not very probable. Maybe he traveled from Edmonton to Calgary and violated his parole conditions, but that's a matter for the police to consider. They would certainly know that. In the case of the violation of his parole to travel to Banff, we've already mentioned that Keely Louise Pincott is found on the route to Banff, north of Cochrane. But it's also worth mentioning that Boutillier is found northwest of the city in March of 93. And this is also, could be argued, is on the route to Banff. And then the matter of the shallow graves we've already talked about, but we might as well say it again. Jans, Joins, Pincott, and Hempel, all found in shallow graves. And in the case of Hempel, it's a stranger homicide. Stephen Bearns is convicted and later commits suicide. Concerning the impaired driving event, so let's look at this again. January 31st, 1993, he's charged with impaired driving. He's found asleep at the wheel of his car at midnight in the parking lot of a convenience store close to home. Now, Gregoire's home was in the Castlebridge area of Calgary. That's where he's living at this time, which is the northeast end of the city. A convenience store close to his home would have been the 7-Eleven where Silva worked, where she was abducted. That Ruddlehorn 7-Eleven is just south of Castleridge. So the question is, was Gregoire using the 7-Eleven where he was abducted, where he abducted Silva on May 3rd, 1993? Was he using it as a staging ground for his crimes as early as 3 months prior that we know of, January 1993? And is this where is this where Ewan was first seen, possibly going into the convenience store before going to her Castlebridge home? Was Boutillier, by any chance, in that grocery store before she went missing in 1993? We don't know, but it's very curious. Again, so we've said that Gregoire lived in Castlebridge, and that Ada Ewan was abducted from her Castlebridge neighborhood. So clearly Gregoire at this point is hunting in his own neighborhood. and but he's not disposing the bodies in his neighborhood. Note the pattern of the dump sites of Gillivish, Antsill, McMaster, and Maunder. All are found on or near 17th Avenue Southeast, south of where Gregoire lived in Castlebridge. And going back to the Quebec cases, note a similar pattern in the Quebec cases of Allure, Camera, and Dubé. Those bodies were dumped to the south of Sherbrooke and Lennoxville, and the geographic profiler Kim Rosmo determined the offender in those cases most likely lived north of the dump sites in the city. And also note that Gregoire was investigated by the Sûreté de Québec as a suspect in the Theresa Allure case, and that he certainly did live, just as Kim Rosmo predicted. One of his residences was with his mother in the town of Sherbrooke, so north of dump sites. Something else I'd note about these cases: as the cases progress, police communicate less and less about what happened or how the victims died. We don't know any of this. We have bits and pieces. We know some were stabbed. We know some were found in shallow graves. But in some cases, that's all we know. We know that Silva was dumped in Calgary, but further, from a Calgary Herald article, we know that Gregoire strangled and raped her before dumping her body in a ditch along 80th Avenue Northeast, an area that was at the edge of the city back then. Homicide investigators arrested Gregoire after a surveillance team saw him trying to dispose of a bag containing Silva's belongings. Initially, Gregoire refused to tell investigators anything, including the location of Silva's body, which was found the next day by a passerby. I will note in the case of Silva, she's dumped north of Castlebridge. If you look on a map, I don't know if it's a question of him near the end getting reckless, or I don't know if it's a case of him always being this reckless. Again, he always seemed very, very impulsive and extremely lucky. But in the case of the events surrounding Silva, abducted or attempted to abduct Ewan in his own neighborhood and dumped Silva just north of his neighborhood. Maunder and Boutellier are stabbed. And we note that the prostitute attacked on April 3rd, 1993 was assaulted with a roofing hammer. And in two Quebec cases from the late 70s, when Gregoire was living in Sherbrooke, victims were assaulted with a screwdriver or an ice pick. And if you want to know what I'm referencing there, if you listen to episode 2, where we talk about the history of violence against women in the Sherbrooke area, 77 to 1980, a period when Gregoire was, yes, in the airborne, but also stationed partially in Petawawa and presumably coming home to Sherbrooke on day passes or vacations, etc. And that Gregoire matched the description given by many of these women. A short man, 5'5", described as military stupid, someone who described himself as an electrician, a handyman, etc. The woman assaulted in the Sherbrooke, Quebec parking lot in 1991, Nicole Couture, never went into details, but she said, "Then he did things to me that I don't want to talk about. I was in a terrible state. I was bleeding everywhere." And remember, this is a victim who survived. I would link back to the fact that police wouldn't disclose the nature of level of violence on subsequent victims. Wisely, they kept all of that close to the chest. It's unfortunate for our purposes, but for their own purposes, it's good police work. They have a lot of giveaways that only the offender would know. So, in summary, my assessment of all of this, again, a conservative assessment. I'm not trying to link everything in. I'm not trying to tie Gregoire to all, just under a dozen murders in Calgary, plus the Quebec murders. I'm not saying that at all. But my assessment would be that there's a good possibility that Gregoire is responsible for the murders of Anita Gilovish, Tracy Maunder, Jean McMaster, Claudette Anstill, and Rebecca Boutillier. And you will note that the media was initially quite diligent in pursuing the angle of a serial predator in this area, and they quickly dropped it. And perhaps they saw that there was no evidence to support Gregoire, or perhaps it's something more. Because you have to consider this. What would it say to the Calgary community and the criminal justice system of Alberta if Gregoire was allowed to prey on that community's some of its most vulnerable members for over 17 months, right under the noses of those that were enlisted to protect its citizens, the Calgary Police Service and the Calgary Central Parole Office. And we note that eventually the Silva family settled court actions in the amount of $800,000. How much money could families, if this were possible that it was Gregoire, what would be the potential liability of all of these families? Might Gregoire be the man responsible for all of these deaths? Has law enforcement and the media been entirely transparent and responsible in these matters? Did they abandon the cause of a marginalized population? Are they at best lazy investigators, and at worst, are they complicit in something bigger? Luc Gregoire is dead, and we may never know. That's our podcast for this week. All of this information, or a lot of the details, I have up on my website. In fact, this is one of the few episodes where I actually, to a large part, wrote out the episode first and published it and then podcast it. The primary reason for that is up until now, what I've really been doing is reporting past research that I've done. This is the first time that I actually have podcasted new research. So it was very, very fresh, and I wanted to get the details down. So hope you enjoyed it, and the benefit is if you want to listen to it or if you want to read it, both formats are there with lots of links to lots of the background in these matters. So in some ways, a special episode out to listeners in Alberta and particularly in Calgary. Hope you enjoy it. Some housekeeping items. As I've mentioned about 5 times now, I have a website. It's www.theresalore.com, TheresaAllore.com. You can find me on Twitter at Justice Guy. That's at JUSTUSGUY. There is a YouTube channel if you want to see me walking and talking, and people we talk about walking and talking, the investigators, advocates, etc. There's a film archive that I keep out there of any news magazines that over the years have kept things. If you just search Theresa Allure, you can find it. There's also a Facebook page. It's called Who Killed Theresa, the podcast, if you want to follow along there. I occasionally publish things related to victim advocacy and criminal justice that I don't necessarily particularly choose to podcast about. I think we've covered it. I think we've done it. We've done the podcast. I've said what I wanted to say in the way that I wanted to say it. So brava on me. Have yourselves a great evening and hope to have you listening next time. Thank you.